All right, so welcome everyone. This is our workshop today by Marcos Benevides. The title is, if I get it right, a universal rubric for task outcome assessment. Okay, so Marcos. Please.
Okay, thank you very much, Blair. One point is please don't use chat while I'm presenting because it's one extra thing to look at. So I won't be reading the chats, but if you do want to interrupt and ask a question, then please just turn on your microphone and say excuse me or something like that. Thank you very much, Blair. So to get started, this is a presentation that was meant to follow up on a presentation that a co-researcher and I, Jeff Martin, I don't know if some of you may know, a young man who's just started his PhD at Temple. We are researching the reliability of this rubric that I've been developing for a number of years for TBLT. And we were supposed to present this August at ILA in Netherlands. But of course, it got delayed, it got postponed till next year, so that never happened. So when I put in for this workshop at JALT, I was thinking that this was going to be the second stage and already perhaps building on the data that we would have been gathering this year and the feedback that we would have gotten at ILA. So unfortunately, that never happened. So this is a little bit of a throwback to the presentation that I gave actually at JALT last year, which was presenting the original rubric. So this workshop is basically setting out the case for having a universal rubric for task-based assessment. And so in order to do that, I'm going to start with just a little bit of basics. I won't belabor the point too much as to what is task-based language teaching. But it is important to make the point because it goes to the heart of why task-based assessment is inherently different and important if you're going to do task-based learning. So I just want to start very briefly to outline some of the important principles of TBLT and why we need TBLT and then how we can do TBLT assessment specifically. So to begin, I want to outline just three main principles. These are fundamental to task-based learning. And the first is that TBLT is a communicative approach. It's the evolution, I like to say. It's the evolution of the communicative language teaching approach in that it gives priority to meaning above language forms practice. And I say it's the evolution because the communicative approach in a very broad sense highlighted the fact that, of course, communication should be an important part of what we teach when we teach language. But the communicative approach itself doesn't very specifically lay out how this can be done. And what TBLT brings to the table, essentially, is a more systematic approach how to do communicative teaching. But this priority to meaning is very central. It's the first important concept that we need to apply and not lose sight of. Now, this is the real heart of this. This is the real innovation of TBLT within the context of communicative teaching. It employs the task, this idea of the task, as a unit of sequencing and instruction. And this is where the real innovation, I think, was introduced through task-based learning, because before TBLT, there was a bit of a fuzzier notion as to what are these communicative things that we are teaching. But with TBLT, this concept of tasks that are sequenced for instruction and that are assessed on their own terms as tasks really makes the approach very practical and implementable in a way that maybe the communicative approach, broadly speaking, has had lots of criticisms, right? And we see this in Japan. I remember in 1998 when I first started teaching in Japan. There was already a push by the Ministry of Education to have more communication in the high schools and the universities. And it fell flat. It always kept falling flat. And part of the reason it kept falling flat, I would argue, is not because teachers aren't sold on the idea. I think even back then, teachers were aware of the fact that a communicative approach is important at least part of the time. I think where it met resistance is the practical side of how to implement it in the classroom and how to assess it, very importantly. And for that reason, I think TBLT has, some people, it has created a kind of a backlash. People have perhaps tried it and it didn't quite work the way they intended, and they've reverted to other ways of teaching. Perhaps I feel like some people have, it's gotten a bit of a bad reputation through poor implementation, perhaps. But if we go back to these main principles, priority and meaning, and then the task as the unit of sequencing and instruction, and one further one, which is the idea that tasks have real world-like outcomes, and they must be assessed on these outcomes over linguistic factors, language forms, and so on. And I use the term real world-like in order to avoid more problematic terms like authenticity and so on. But the idea is that tasks have a kind of an ideal target form out in the real world. And pedagogic tasks that we do in the classroom are assessed with that in mind. So they're assessed more holistically, perhaps, because they're aiming at these real world-like outcomes. This will become clearer in a minute as I go through. So in a nutshell, that's TBLT. And I'd like to also make the point as to why we need TBLT. And I think it's in the past number of years, I've been trying to come up with ways of making TBLT explainable to teachers through teacher training, and also explainable to students so that they can apply it appropriately in a principled way. And so one of the kind of analogies I've come up with over the years is the idea of conceptualizing language and how we can conceptualize language and then present it to the students in a variety of ways. So if you think of language for a moment and try to conceptualize it as a cloud, I think it's a good metaphor, a good analogy, because like a cloud, language is complex, it's massive, it's a shapeless, shifting thing that is amorphous. It doesn't really have a particular shape. But the farther away you are from it, you can point to it and you can say, yeah, that's a cloud. Yeah, that's English, that's French, the farther you are from it. But the closer you are to it, the more you kind of get drawn into that cloud, and there's no clear dividing line, right? And you can see this especially when you have languages that bump into each other, like clouds sort of bump into each other. They at the edges, it's hard to tell which one is which. But they are a thing, right? And they are a complex thing, and it's difficult to sort of describe and explain what it is. And so one of the ways we do that is we break it into pieces, right? So that's the sort of the synthetic kind of grammar approach. We lay a grid on it. If you're familiar with the theories of Ferdinand de Saussure, you kind of lay a grid through which you can then describe the discrete pieces of it. And I use the word grammar here, but you can think of any kind of divisional or classification system to the pieces of the cloud, right? So you sort of pin the cloud, you make it static, and then you describe it in terms of its discrete pieces, which could be grammar points, could be vocabulary, could be lexical, could be pragmatic, right? They're all the different ways that we can describe language. And to further the analogy away from a cloud for a minute, there's something that artists do when they want to reproduce complexity, right? So if you have a picture like this that you want to reproduce, create a reproduction of it, there's a trick that artists use that I think, again, has an analogy. They take the complexity of the picture and they divide it up, again, into a kind of grid. And then on the canvas, the sort of the target canvas, it's a blank canvas and they have the same grid. And so the trick is, and this is a great trick if you want to take an image and blow it up, for example, but basically you're reproducing it. And the trick is to go bit by bit, right? So this is a kind of synthetic approach. You can think of it as a way of breaking down a complex system into component parts that can then be introduced bit by bit, and until you get the whole form, right, at the end. You do bit by bit, you color in bit by bit as well. In 1976, all the way back then, Wilkins called attention to this kind of approach in language teaching as the synthetic approach. And I quote him as, he said, "A synthetic language teaching strategy is one in which the different parts of the language are taught separately and step by step, so that the acquisition becomes a process of gradual accumulation of parts until the whole structure of the language has been built up." Okay? And I think we can look at this as a good analogy of how we teach grammar and lexical items and so on. And it's an effective way. It's an effective way of reproducing a complex system, right? It is actually an effective way of teaching language as well, except for one complicating factor here, which is motivation. Now, if you're an artist and you're doing this over the course of a couple of hours, your payoff at the end, this picture that you finished, is done in a couple of hours, no problem. But if you're learning language this way, bit by bit, right? So you're learning the past tense today, you're learning pronouns tomorrow, whatever. It's not a particularly motivating way of learning language, because at no point do you have something complete and whole that you can use until the very end, right? And the process of language learning, of course, takes months and years. So learning language this way would be effective if we were, computers that were, didn't have to worry about motivation. But it doesn't work so well for people who are learning this way, or at least it doesn't work so well if that's the only thing that you're doing. So TBLT brings in another way of conceptualizing how we are reproducing this complex system, which is a language. So if we look at it, if we try to think of what would be the solution, what would TBLT try to do? Well, remember that it's an approach that prioritizes meaning over form. And meaning depends on context, on seeing the whole picture. Okay? So with a TBLT approach, what you're trying to do is not create that grid, but looking at the whole picture all at once in order for it to be meaningful. In the words of Michael Long, one of the big, of course, proponents of TBLT, instructional materials in TBLT take the form of pedagogic tasks, classroom tasks, that are initially simple and then more and more complex approximations of that target task. But what he is really saying that's important here is that a pedagogic task should be a holistic and meaningful approximation of the real world task. In other words, it should give a complete picture right from the beginning. It can't be sort of sectional, the way that grammar approach is. So to go back to the analogy, how would that work? Well, it would work more like a series of whole sketches than a very detailed study of discrete parts, right? So it's another approach to presenting the sort of complex picture. So rather than going little by little and building up as you go, you would start with something that already gives you the whole picture, but of course is not completely formed perhaps. But you can look at it and go, that's a cloud, that's a cloud, that's a cloud, right? It looks like the whole thing. It's meaningful, inherently meaningful, because it's holistic. So this is what a task-based approach tries to do. The task is always holistic and meaningful on its own, even though, of course, it's not complete. Eventually, it's complete. So if you go through a series of tasks that are increasingly more complex, you'll eventually get to this full complex system. And that perhaps is even more true if you're doing both of those things at the same time, right? So if you have something like this holistic task-based approach, while at the same time you're looking at the details as you go along, that would of course be the best way to do it. But the important thing is to not lose sight of this holistic nature of TBLT, which teachers tend to do. And this is why when I do teacher training workshops on TBLT, I try to stress this case, because we have a tendency to revert back to a more sort of systematic grammar approach, because that's the way that we've been taught, essentially. So the question then becomes, how do we do TBLT effectively? And of course, this, I could go on about this for hours, but I'll focus today on assessment. And I'll focus on the idea that tasks, as I mentioned, have real world-like outcomes and have to be assessed on those outcomes. So how do we do TBLT assessment? Well, Peter Skian, this is to highlight the importance of TBLT assessment. Peter Skian, another, of course, big proponent of TBLT, raises the issue. He says that if task-based approaches to teaching are not complemented by task-based approaches to testing, they can come under threat. In other words, if, for example, testing is based on linguistic units and formats are used that aren't communicative in nature, then teaching is likely to gravitate towards this style. So imagine, for example, that you set up a very communicative task that has a meaningful outcome. Let's say, for example, you have your students write a thank you letter, right? A task that has a communicative outcome. You can point to the outcome and say, okay, it's thankful enough, right? If you then assess, if you test that letter based primarily on linguistic units, or grammar mistakes and so on, then what you're in danger is the teaching that you are doing, the tasks that you're setting up, of reverting back to that kind of grammar and language forms focused instruction. Because of course, students will understand what it is that you're looking for, and they'll start giving it to you. They'll start focusing more on accuracy than meaning, for example. So what Skian suggests is that task-based tests need to become more commonplace. And I agree with him very much that this is the crux of the issue in task-based learning today. It's that it's not that teachers need to be sold on the fact that communicative approach is important. I think we're all in agreement with that. What teachers need to be made aware of is how task-based testing can and should work. And it needs to become commonplace and intuitive. Because if it's not, then we have this tendency to revert back, give grammar quizzes and lexical quizzes and so on. So how do we do task-based assessment? Well, there are a few things that you can focus on. I'd like you to focus, first of all, on this idea of functional adequacy. And this was introduced by Kuiken and Vedder in 2017 in a paper they did focusing on writing especially. But the concept applies to task-based learning. They also presented the plenary at the task-based learning conference last year, again on functional adequacy. The idea being that the first important point that needs to be taken into account is this functional dimension of tasks, of L2 production. So again, to use the example of a thank you letter may be grammatically perfect or may have many errors, may use the right lexical items or not. But in the end, it's a thank you letter based on the quality of thankfulness that the reader receives by reading it, right? So all other factors are secondary. Primary factor should be this idea of functional adequacy. Again, the outcome needs to be, we need to focus on functional adequacy. So how do we do that? By what criteria can we judge the adequacy of the outcome? Question number two, I'll get to later, but it's also an important question because it's not just the fact that the teachers don't intuitively know how to do TBLT, but also the learners don't know that too. If we are having a task-based class in which we tell students, I'm not going to give you any grammar or vocabulary tests, clearly we have to let the students know on what basis we are in fact assessing them. So that's also important to bear in mind. But let's go back to question number 1 for a minute. By what criteria can we judge the adequacy of the outcome? Well, there are a few systems already that exist. The CEFR, I'm sure most of you are aware of, the Common European Framework of Reference. There are a few others that are similar. These are language descriptor systems, and they describe language in a more holistic, in a more narrative focused way. And they are based on can-do statements and things that on the functionality of the language, what it is that students can do, learners can do. I actually recommend the Canadian language benchmarks. If you're familiar with CEFR, one of the criticisms of CEFR is that it's very sort of theory-oriented and it's not as practical. And I would tend to agree with that, at least the earlier versions of the CEFR that I'm more familiar with. The 2003 document, for example, it was a 300-page description that I wouldn't recommend to grad students who are learning how to teach English. It was a little bit dense and very theoretical in nature. The Canadian language benchmarks is much more practical and sort of easy to use on a practical level in the classroom. And the American ACTFL system, I'm less familiar with that, but it's the same basic idea, descriptors of language. So this is one way to do it. The problem with assessing language according to these systems is that it's a little bit clunky. You are relying on these long descriptors of what it is students can do. And it's not really the kind of thing you can just whip up in the classroom if you want to judge how a particular task is being done. Another way to do it, and this is something I haven't explored very much until very, very recently, but Grice's maxims, which are used in pragmatics, could be one way to sort of simplify this approach to a task-based approach that's based on meaning. The maxims look at things, at qualities of the communicative, the cooperative principle in communication. The idea of quantity, for example, is that a task outcome, the performance, provides enough information for the situation, the context, not more and not less, right? And we can look at a simple example. If somebody asks you, "Hi, how are you?" and you give them an answer, "I'm fine, thanks." That's just enough information, not more, not less, right? If you don't answer at all, it would be interpreted perhaps as you being, you're breaking the maximum, therefore you're being perhaps a little bit rude or insulting and so on. But just as problematic would be if you gave a long drawn out answer, right? Because that would also be breaking the maximum of quantity. So this idea of quantity is important. So when we assess or when we judge a spoken speech, for example, or a presentation, we can judge according to these criteria rather easily, right? Did the student speak too much or too little, right? It's a inherently simple judgment call that can be made. Quality or relation. I've adapted these maxims, by the way. So if you're familiar with the 4 maxims, you'll realize that I've only got 3 here. I've adapted it to make it even a little bit more applicable, I think, to assessment in the classroom. But if you think about the quality of relation maxim, there are 2 maxims that I've conflated here. But basically, it's the quality of the content, right? Is it good, appropriate? Is it relevant? Is it pertinent information? So again, if you think of a student giving a presentation, number 1 would look at how short or how long the presentation was, too short or too long. Number 2 would look at, is the information correct? Is it appropriate and relevant to what was asked in the assignment, right? And the 3rd one could be manner. And here I've perhaps shockingly reinterpreted maxims, Grice's maxims of manner to, in this case, be more to do with the mode or formality of the context, because I think that's important when you're judging a communicative act, right? So is it suitable? Is it, for example, polite enough? Is it too polite, perhaps, which could also be a problem. So this is a sort of a simple way to eyeball, to thumbnail whether a task is performed adequately or not. Okay, and remember, this is where I'm going with this, because I'm not. You're sitting back. Some of you are and thinking, well, this is all fine and good, but it's very subjective and fuzzy. It's not as reliable as some other ways of judging task outcome. And I'll say, yes, of course, that's true, right? If you have a test like the ACAN or TOEIC, for example, that is much more task-based than it had been in the past, I would argue that's actually a really good, very valid way of judging performance. The problem is, it's not useful in the classroom. It's not something you can walk into the classroom and use, obviously, right? ACAN test and so on. So the solution that I'm looking for here is something that is intuitive and easy for teachers to use in the classroom, like you might put together a 10-item quiz to judge, how well the student knows the past tense. You might be able to do this to quickly judge how a task is performed. So it's reliable enough, I think, is the standard that I'm looking for here. And this, of course, is another way. I think I had another one here. Another way of judging performance, especially for spoken performance, right? So these are some scoring sheets that I found online. I'm sorry that I don't have the source here, and I can't credit who they're from. But these are sort of judging sheets that are used for things like speech contests and presentations. And I would argue that these are too unwieldy in the classroom. They're too complex to use in the day-to-day. You might use it for something like a speech contest. But if you look at the items and you consider the cognitive involvement that a judge would need to apply to this to be able to judge a particular performance, it's highly complex. It would take an hour to properly assess one student's performance in this way. So although this is arguably a valid and reliable way of assessing performance, I would say that it doesn't really work in the classroom, at least not in the day-to-day. And it's certainly not very intuitive with this list of things that you're checking off. So what I've suggested and what I would suggest is a much simpler approach that has 3 steps. Okay? Step 1 being, is the task outcome achieved? Again, this goes back to Kuiken and Vedder's idea of functional adequacy. So when you're assessing task-based performance, task outcome, whether it's a spoken task or a writing task or any other kind of task, the first thing you ask yourself is this functionally adequate? Is it achieved, yes or no? That yes or no question is the primary question that you're asking. This is how we put meaning in a primary sense. And if yes, then you go to step 2. But if no, you go to step 3. Step 2, now you're thinking about quality. How well is it achieved? And in the context of a classroom, something that's like a 10-point quiz, you can give a score from 6 to 10. How well is it achieved? Well, pretty good, not so good, and so on, from 6 to 10. And then you go to step 3 and you give feedback. And this is a very important step. And it's also important to note that this step includes, secondarily, a focus on forms. Okay, so you provide feedback and you include a focus on language forms if appropriate. And also importantly, you provide a chance to redo the task. Okay, and this is also an important concept, an important principle of task-based learning that sometimes gets lost on the wayside. In task-based learning, because it's focused on meaning, it's important to let the student perform the task, to in a sense, jump into the task, do it, perhaps not achieve it, but get feedback, and through that feedback, do the task again in a better way. Okay? This sometimes gets lost in the instructional shuffle, but it's an important thing to do, this task cycle. And it's also important, because you're doing this, it's also important to think to consider the fact that you are not failing the student for not achieving the task. This concept of fail in this case shouldn't be applied as strictly as we would with other kinds of assessment. In other words, instead of saying fail, they simply haven't achieved the task yet. But give them feedback and a chance to redo, and then perhaps they will again. Okay. So these three steps, especially in particular, step number one, are crucial, I think, to good task-based assessment. And it's also simple enough to be intuitive for teachers to be able to apply in the classroom. And yet they can give a numerical score. So let's take a look. Again, that first step, yes or no, is the task outcome achieved? How well is it achieved? And then feedback. So this is the rubric that I've come up with for now. I'm still kind of reworking, and as I said before, I've been thinking about Grice's maxims recently. So I'm wondering if step 3, the feedback section, could somehow have an easy, intuitive way of feeding back into the maxims. But for now, this is what I propose as a kind of universal rubric for task outcome assessment. And this could be filled in by the teacher and given to the student. And it's a flowchart system that follows through very quickly, very easily between steps 1 and 2. And then step 3, of course, is a little bit more open. So let's see how we might fill that in. This is what I've been using for a task in my own class, where the students are doing an elevator pitch, pitching an idea for a minute. So what's important, of course, to lay out is, because the rubric is universal, you have to lay out exactly what the particular task is that you are going to be doing. So in this case, it's to make an elevator pitch. Of course, the student will need to have more information than this, but assuming that for now you've explained to the student. And then the outcome that we are looking for is that the student will have pitched a clear, easy to understand idea in a persuasive manner. And it's important as well, of course, to set parameters, because this goes to the grading. So for example, in this case, the maximum 1 minute of speaking, it's also important that they clearly explain the function. And it's also important, if they want to use appropriate props, appropriate for the context of an elevator pitch. So let's look at an example. I've got a video here that I'm going to play. I'm sorry. Actually, no, I'm not sorry. I was going to say I'm sorry to those of you who might have seen this before, but I don't think you have. I think I've put in, oh no, I'm sorry. You may have seen this before if you saw my presentation. So what I'd like you to do is to watch this presentation, this video, with those 2 points in mind. Okay. Number 1, yes or no. Does the student succeed in giving an elevator pitch? Don't worry too much about reasons why or why not. Okay. Just a yes or no decision. And if it's a yes, then please consider from 6 to 10, what score would you give it? Okay. And after I show this, I'd like to ask everyone to put in their score. So 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, if it's a pass, right? And if it's not, then we'll talk about that. So here we go.
Hello, I'm gonna talk about my new product idea. This product will help many people who don't sleep immediately. I think many people has a trouble recently that they can't sleep immediately because their work and their phone. So I want to solve this problem. So I came up with this idea that I called Good Night Box. Good Night Box can let people fall asleep. So prepare your phone, and this is a Good Night Box. And how to use this? Good Night Box connect into this area. Phone has a hole in this area, and gas comes from here. The gas can make people sleep. So this is easy. What do you think of this idea?
Okay. So, we are thinking yes or no. So was it an elevator pitch? If you're not familiar with the concept of elevator pitch, it's a short pitch that puts forward an idea, right? It's called an elevator pitch because the idea is if you run into the president of your company in the elevator and you only have 1 minute to tell her, you know, this great idea you've had that's going to change the company. That's why it's called an elevator pitch. So yes or no. Can we, I said I wasn't going to be looking at the chat, but I'm going to open the chat now so I can see. So please type in Y or N for yes or no if you think that he accomplished the task. Yes, yes, yes. Okay. All right. So I think that's pretty clear, right? I don't think there's much room for disagreement in this case. We can all agree that he has accomplished the task. Now, how well did he accomplish it? Is it a 6 out of 10, just barely passed? Is it a 10 out of 10, perfect, or somewhere in between? So please type in a number from 6 to 10. Okay. Wow, that's very quick. Let me see, I'm seeing 7, 8, 8, 8, 7, 7, 8, 9, 8, 7, 8, 8. Okay, so this is about in line with what we have been discovering. We've given this presentation a number of times. I think we're probably up to 200 audience members at this point, something like that. And what we have found is that for this particular presentation, expert but non-trained raters, which is what you are. You're expert raters because you're teachers. You're non-trained because we didn't have any kind of rater reliability training before we did this. Tend to be pretty good. It's pretty reliable judging this particular task, which, by the way, is fairly complex in that it does include the sort of persuasiveness as one of the categories. And what we found is that it's basically a 7.5 that this student tends to get. People oscillate a little bit between 7 and 8, which I would argue is pretty darn reliable for the classroom, right? It's obviously not as good a tool as something like the ACAN or TOEIC, but it is pretty reliable for the classroom. And I think that's an important point to note because we have a tendency to look at this kind of assessment that feels sort of off the cuff, right? And we have a tendency to look at this and go, no, this is way too subjective. But I would argue that a 10-point lexical item quiz or grammar quiz that you might put together would be just as subjective and yet useful in the classroom. So this is, I think, a demonstration of how this kind of universal rubric can be easy to use, intuitive, and still pretty good enough at least for the classroom. And I'll show you how I filled it in as a teacher. And so in this case, of course, it's a yes. I gave it an 8. And my feedback was basically it's very good, very clear. You're confident. You did make a few mistakes. They didn't affect comprehension. But I point out a couple of the sort of vocabulary or pronunciation mistakes that he had here. In this case, I would argue that it was good enough that he doesn't need to do it again, but I leave it as optional pretty much for every student if they want to try it again. The redo becomes especially important for the students who somehow don't manage to achieve the task. So basically, again, these 3 steps are intuitive and easy to understand. Shall we try one more? That's a rhetorical question. Yes, of course we will. Let's try one more that I had this year. Here we go.
Excuse me, I'm sorry to bother you, but I'd like to propose my new product idea, and I think you will love it. Thank you, I'll be just a minute. So here it is. I name it Nagomi, and this is a brand new product combining aroma diffuser and music player, but each can be used independently. It's for people who have trouble sleeping or have stressful days. The usage is very simple. First, put water and a few drops of aroma oil in the diffuser, then press the start button. Later, connect your phone with the music player by Wi-Fi and then play your favorite music. This product can be used by anybody regardless of age, so I believe it will definitely be a bestseller around the world.
Okay, so that's another one. I think we can dispense with a yes or no in this case. It's pretty clear that it's a yes. But what would be your score from 6 to 10 again? So please write it down on the chat. Okay, yeah, quite a bit higher. 9s and 10s. 9.5, yeah. I personally gave her a 10. I gave her, this was maybe the best one I've ever seen for this particular task. And I use it as an example to the students now, because not only is her performance itself very good, not only is she obviously well rehearsed and she practiced many times, but even the small details like putting on a background that's professional looking behind her, is just, you know, I literally couldn't think of anything that she could have done better. So I gave her a 10, but if you think that's a 9 or a 9.5, I think that's again a fair score. I think this range from 9 to 10 here, a 1-point range for this kind of assessment is quite acceptable. And the second question, which we may not have time to get to in too much detail, it's we've got until 5:45. Is that right, Blair? 15 minutes?
Yes, that's right.
About that, okay. Maybe we will have. I'll at least run through it with you. But one thing that's important is, of course, to make the learners understand how TBLT assessment works, because it's not intuitive to them either. And they're also looking for these kinds of answers. So what I've been doing this year, and this has really facilitated things for me, is because of the COVID situation, I've put items of my course online. And so for this particular course that they are doing, where they have to do an elevator pitch, what I did is I set up on Moodle some example elevator pitches, just like we saw. And essentially what we're doing now, by the way, is radar reliability, right? This is what radar reliability training looks like. What I've done is set it up so students can do it as well. And so I've set up a Moodle where they have to go through and evaluate some elevator pitches and product proposals. This is the task that comes before the elevator pitch. This is a writing task. So they do essentially the same thing. They look at the task outcome, they look at the product proposal, and then they rate it and give it a grade. And then they look at the grade that the teacher gave, and they consider it. Do you agree, right? This isn't itself a graded assignment. It's a participation assignment, but I am training them to see what it is that I'm looking for, so that when I do the actual assignment, they'll do a better job. So they may give that particular thing a C or B and so on, but then they see the teacher's score and they consider maybe why. They do it again. They do it 3 times. This one was a D. They look at why, and then they look at another one. I think I only put 2 here, but they do it 3 times. And because of the way Moodle is set up, it's especially nice for this kind of task, because you can make the task assignments dependent on each other. So you can see here where it says restricted. First, they evaluate 3 product proposals. When they finish and they click submit, then that second line there, it says submit your product proposal. It becomes active after they have finished the first part. So as an asynchronous sort of assignment that you might have the students do at home, it works really well. You have them go through this and then submit their own product proposal. So what I don't think we'll have too much time for, what I'm going to do is screen share. But I actually can, if anyone's interested in actually going into our Moodle and trying it out themselves, just let me know later. This is actually the username and URL. So you can grab one of these user accounts. Sorry, I've just lost the page here. But what I'm going to do instead, because I don't think we'll have enough time for that to actually happen, is I will show you all at once by showing this Moodle. So this is a student's view of what I was just showing you before. They evaluate the product proposal and then submit their own. They also evaluate elevator pitches. That's what we had done. So let's take a look at what the student would go through. This, by the way, is not based on that universal rubric that I've been developing, but it's still, as you can see, a very simple set of questions, right? Looking at clarity, persuasion, and how well it was prepared. So they answer the questions. Here's another elevator pitch. Let me see. I don't think, may not have an easy way of doing this. I think if I do this, it'll make it larger on your screen. Is that right? You're getting a better proportion?
Yeah, it's a bit larger, yeah.
All right, so let me play this guy. And again, perhaps you can do the same thing. Yes, no, 6 to 10.
Excuse me, sir. I am really sorry for interrupting your work, but I have a new product idea that I think you will love. Here it is. I call it Umbrent. It is a service that people can borrow and return umbrella easily. People can use umbrellas from designated umbrella stand.
I'm going to stop it here, those 30 seconds. I think you already get the gist of what he was saying. You might not have caught the actual name of the product. It's called Umbrent, so umbrella rental, right? But again, it's a well-performed, good performance. I'm not going to go through the numbering again, but I would imagine you'd be giving it 8s and 9s because he does a pretty good job. So then the student, again, would give it, let's say, 4, 4, 4. That's pretty good. Give feedback. What grade would you give it? I'm going to give it an A. Next page, let's see what the teacher gave it. The teacher gave it an A. Very good job. It's clear, professional, persuasive, well-planned, and so on. It's obvious that you practiced a few times before you recorded it. Do you agree? Right? The student is thinking now. Next page, they do it again. And on purpose, I had a good example and then one that's slightly more problematic. In this case, she does a pretty decent job.
Excuse me, Titus. Could you give me time now? I came up with a new product idea. This is Dragon Box.
And I'll stop here. But again, the feedback in this case, it's less good than the others, quite obviously already. She is reading a little bit too much or too obviously reading. Also, the explanation is not especially clear, so you come out of it not quite knowing what it is. So the student might give it a lower score, give some feedback. Let's see, maybe it's a C. Next page. And that was a C+. And so my feedback suggests that I didn't understand some of the points that she said. It's perhaps because you're reading too much, try memorizing it, and so on. So that's the feedback that I gave her. Again, next page, the students do one more. This is that good example that I had shown you before. And once the student finishes filling in this, they have to fill in, these are required fields. They then submit it as having finished. And now they can continue and submit their own elevator pitch. So they've done a little bit of rater reliability rating, but also thinking about what it is that they have to do, what their outcome is meant to look at like. So then they finish and continue, and then they can now come here, and you can see now it's not restricted anymore, right? Now they can submit their own elevator pitch. So I would suggest that this kind of process, if you have the principles of TBLT in mind as you create your lessons, you can easily set up a system like this. It's easy to use. It's functional. and it's at least good enough for the classroom. Thank you. I'm going to stop here and leave 10 minutes for questions or comments if anyone has them. Please go ahead at this point.
Yeah, so if you have a question, please feel free to unmute. And we should thank Marcos as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, this.
Yeah, Marcos.
Mm-hmm.
I would think if there were reliability issues, they would be happening on the low side, where it crosses from 5 to 6.
Very good. Yeah, very good point. Especially if you're looking at this idea of functional adequacy, right?
Yeah.
Because you get to a point where, well, you get some interesting outliers where the students miss the point entirely. I used to actually have one in my presentation as an example, but I took it out because it's a little bit too problematic. People start arguing back and forth about it too much. I have, for example, a student who his spoken proficiency is very high, and he did a great job. However, what he presented was more like a commercial. It wasn't all elevator pitch at all.
Right.
So the fact that I gave him a non-pass, so to speak, really ruffled some feathers with teachers. They're like, but how can he not pass? His English is good. Well, it goes to that focus on functional adequacy that is really important. It doesn't matter why they pass or fail. It's just, if you can give it a score, if you can give it a pass or fail call based on whether it would work in the real world, that's what's important. Then in the feedback section, you can then target why or why not it passed or didn't pass. But that's very true, and especially like you said, is it a 6 or is it a not pass? It's a tough call, and it's an especially tough call for teachers because we want to be helpful to the student, and we perhaps are used to Japanese English, for example, so we can understand a little better. I think it's a problem, and it's something that we need to kind of worry about our own reliability for that sense. What I try to do is I try to imagine whether my brother, who lives in Canada and doesn't know any Japanese speaking people, whether he would accept it as a pass or fail. I try to put my mind into his mind frame, because then it helps me to get away from the sort of katakana English that I can understand. But that's a very good point. Thank you. And Greg?
I really like the peer feedback training to set the expectation. And maybe for Jim's point, if you model a 5, which shows somebody near but not yet meeting the standard, and you also model a 6, and people can kind of see some of that distinction without the points of distinction being so telegraphic that they can't drill down to a little bit more of the subjective distinction, then I think it can maybe set the expectation a little bit.
It's a little bit difficult, though, if you think about it, because it comes down to linguistic factors at that level, right? So a student who, either it comes down to linguistic forms, right? So maybe the pronunciation is so poor that you can't understand it, or perhaps because of linguistic misunderstanding, they didn't understand what the task was. But if it comes down to linguistic factors, then you'd be reinforcing that fact. And I think that's it's a problematic step. It might be okay if you can do it well, but it's a dangerous field to be walking in, because there's a tendency there for the student to go, okay, right, it's linguistic factors that he's looking for rather than the functionality, if that makes any sense, right?
No, I think you simply need to choose very wisely as opposed to randomly, so that is evident.
But the
So
choice that you're making,
someone who meets the task with slightly lower than many of the other classmates linguistically can still get a 6.
Right. Okay. So a low 6, that would be possible to model. The other problem too becomes with, like, if you can show them 100 different performances, then that smooths out, and balances it all out, and they get a good sense. But if you can only give them 1 or 2 or 3 samples, I have tended to show them decent samples. But you're right, if every time I get a student who's lower proficiency but really hits it out of the park, those are like gold to me, because then I can show that to the lower proficiency students as a model. But yeah, that's a good point, Stu. Thank you. 4 minutes. Any other comments or questions?
Actually, I have a question for you.
Sure, Clint. Thank you.
Do you find the students tend to mimic the model? Like, I know this.
I'm sorry, that was
my own
Blair.
student.
Tend to mimic the model.
Yeah, like it's a problem. Like they kind of mimic it too much, and they take a different subject and they're kind of mimicking a model that was slightly on a different topic, but they're kind of mimicking too much of the language that doesn't necessarily apply to their own topic.
The examples that you saw, that very first example that you saw, compared to the second one that was the really good one, you'll notice that the second one and the last one, they both started by saying, "Excuse me, sir, can I interrupt you?" Right? That's because I had shown them a video that showed that, and they looked at that script, and I told them you can use this as a model, right? And again, it's an effective way of getting the students to get their head around what the task is going to be. But it's also, again, a path that is a little bit fraught with danger, because by showing them a model, you may inadvertently be highlighting, again, linguistic factors, or you may be constricting them too much to follow that model. So if you can show them a model and tell them, this is one example, here's another example, now do your own, then that's really ideal, because that allows them the range of freedom to really develop, to be communicative in their own sense. But again, yeah, good point. I would say using a model is good, but choosing models to show is very important too. Student models are always very effective. Sorry, I think Clint had his hand up as well.
Yeah, so I'm familiar with the functional adequacy skills that Kuiken and Vetter made, and they've made a lot of effort into separating out different aspects of functional adequacy.
Mm-hmm.
But you've kind of gone the opposite approach and kind of collapsed everything into a single point. And is there any kind of problems you've run into, or do you find that that's better? How you felt about that?
I haven't modeled their approach myself. I probably should, as part of the research that I'm doing now. My research is basically, we're taking this rubric and basically seeing if it's reliable enough across a range of teachers looking at various tasks. So I can't quite answer that question with data yet. That's where I had hoped to be at this point in the year, but that'll have to be next year. But I would just say that, again, their approach tries to simplify. It's probably not the best word, but tries to go a step towards something that's more practical in the classroom from, for example, Cepher descriptors. But I feel from looking at they had 4 items, I think. They divided it up into
content, comprehensibility, cohesion, and task completion.
That's right. Which of course is better than that long scale of items where you've got 15, 20, 30 things to check off. But I would argue it's still a little bit, it's not intuitive enough for the classroom. I'm looking for something where the teacher just, without even having the formal rubric in front of them, can look at a task and give it a score from 6 to 10, or from 1 to 10, I suppose, sort of off the cuff. That's what I'm looking for, because if we can do that, then it's intuitive enough for teachers to use. Therefore, the approach itself will get implemented and become more commonplace. In the absence of that, anything that's a little bit too clunky to use in the classroom won't get used, and so will undermine the approach, if you see what I mean. So I'm looking for something that's as simple as it can be, while still being reliable enough. I think they're looking for a higher level of reliability than I'm proposing is good enough anyway.
Yeah, on that point, I think it's time. So I think we should cut it off there. Thank you again, Marcos, for your presentation. I found it personally very interesting. And thank you everyone for your participation. I don't know if Marcos wants to take this discussion to the Hangouts, but
Sure, for about 10 minutes though, because
Yeah.
I've got a long bicycle ride home.
so if anyone wants to meet Marcos in the Hangouts, he will be there for 10 minutes.
So
Okay.
the Hangout will be the same number as this room. Is that correct, Blair?
No, you have to leave this. You have to go back to the website and rejoin a different room because there is another presentation coming here. So
Okay.
yeah, so yeah, thank you everyone. Thank you, Marcos.
All right, thank you very much.
Thanks, Marcos.
And of course.
Bye-bye.